I never thought it would happen to us. Not another argument over something so trivial. At least, that's how it started. These days, every conversation between Jack and me seemed to teeter on the edge of becoming a standoff. I used to think I knew him. Used to believe we were a team. But that evening, sitting across from him in our dimly lit living room, I realized I didn't recognize the person he'd become. Or maybe I never truly knew him at all. It began with him trying to be considerate, I suppose. He'd had a long day at work but still made an effort. "Do you want to spend some time together tonight?" he asked. Simple enough, right? Just a gesture to set aside distractions and focus on us. He probably thought I'd appreciate it. Expected me to say something like "that sounds nice," or maybe even "thanks for asking." What he didn't expect was my response. A sharp, almost rehearsed dismissal. "I don't owe you my time," I said. At first, he thought he'd misheard me. He blinked, leaning forward as if that extra inch would somehow change the meaning of my words. "What?" he asked, half laughing, half nervous. "What does that even mean?" I didn't flinch. My eyes locked on his, arms crossed defensively. "It means exactly what it sounds like," I snapped. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." I watched the ground shift beneath him. The air seemed to get sucked out of the room. 8 years. 8 years of late nights, sacrifices, and bending over backward to build a life together. And here I was, telling him point blank that what he thought didn't matter. That his needs, his feelings weren't worth my consideration. His first instinct was to argue, to fight back. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to tell me how much those words stung. How they hit like daggers in places he didn't even know were vulnerable. But the words wouldn't come. He just sat there, staring at me, his mind racing, his mouth unable to catch up. I looked back at him, stone-faced, as if daring him to say something that would make me care. It wasn't like this was new. It wasn't the first time I'd made Jack feel invisible. But it was the first time I'd said it so plainly, so unapologetically. That night, he barely slept. I could hear him tossing and turning, replaying our conversation over and over in his head. My words echoed like a broken record. "I don't owe you my time." Had he missed the signs? Had he done something to push me away? Or had he been fooling himself all along, thinking we were still a team? Each question came with a fresh wave of frustration. By morning, that frustration had turned into something else, resolve. I didn't owe him my time? Fine. But then maybe he didn't owe me his either. The endless sacrifices he'd been making to keep our marriage afloat, maybe those weren't necessary anymore. The version of himself that bent over backward, rearranged his life, and suppressed his own eds just to keep us from crumbling, maybe that version could retire. He didn't say anything to me right away. What was the point? Words hadn't gotten through to me before, so why would they now? Instead, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He started paying attention. Not just to me, but to us. He watched how we interacted, how I treated him, and how little effort I seemed to put into our life together. And the more he noticed, the more convinced he became that something had to change. He didn't know what that change would look like yet. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let my words define his worth. Not anymore. Looking back, that night was a turning point. It wasn't dramatic, no slammed doors or broken dishes. But it was the moment Jack started seeing our marriage for what it was, not what he wanted it to be. For the first time in years, he stopped asking himself what he could do to make things better. Instead, he started asking what he deserved. I probably thought the fight was over when I walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there with his thoughts. But for him, it was just beginning. The days that followed that conversation were different. Not because anything had changed between us. If anything, the silence between us only grew. But something had shifted inside him. For years, Jack had carried the weight of our marriage like some unspoken duty. He worked late, skipped outings with friends, canceled plans when I said I needed him. He bent himself into whatever shape he thought would make me happy. But now, for the first time, he started asking himself why. He couldn't stop thinking about my words, "I don't owe you anything." It was such a cold, matter-of-fact statement. The more he replayed it, the more he realized how one-sided our relationship had become. I don't know if it happened gradually or if he just refused to see it. But the evidence was suddenly everywhere, glaringly obvious. He thought about the nights he stayed up late working overtime to save for the down payment on our house. Back then, I told him how proud I was, how lucky I felt to have someone who cared so much about our future together. He clung to those words, let them fuel him through exhaustion and stress. Because he thought he was building something for us. But now those words felt like a distant echo. A memory from someone who didn't exist anymore. It wasn't just the big sacrifices either. It was the little things, the ones you don't even notice piling up until they bury you. The times he made my coffee in the mornings, not because he drank it, but because I liked to start my day with a cup. The nights he stayed up listening to me vent about work, even when he was bone-tired. Just so I wouldn't feel alone. The weekends spent running errands or fixing things around the house because I didn't like calling a repairman. It all seemed so small in the moment. But now, looking back, it felt like a pattern. He gave and gave and gave. And when he needed even the smallest thing in return, he got a shrug or an excuse. Or worse, nothing at all. He started noticing how easily I dismissed him, like he was just background noise in my life. There was the time he came home excited about a new project at work, and I barely looked up from my phone. Or the night he made my favorite dinner after what he knew had been a stressful week. All he got was a distracted thanks before I walked off. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger picture he had been too blind or too stubborn to see. At first, he told himself I was just stressed. That maybe he hadn't been doing enough to make me feel supported. But the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about stress. It wasn't about him not doing enough. It was about me not valuing what he did at all. He started keeping track, not on paper, but in his head. He paid attention to every moment I brushed him off or ignored him. Every time he made an effort and I didn't even notice. The imbalance became impossible to ignore. A weight pressing down on him every time we were in the same room. And yet, the worst part wasn't even the imbalance itself. It was how easy it was for me not to notice. When he stopped trying, stopped asking how my day was, stopped filling the silence with conversation. I didn't seem to care. If anything, it felt like I preferred the distance. Like his efforts had only been an inconvenience to me all along. One night, he came home late from work. The house was dark, and I was already in bed. He sat in the car for a long time before coming inside. Staring at the dashboard and wondering why he even bothered. It was his house too, but he felt like a stranger there. Like he didn't belong. He thought about what I'd said, how I didn't owe him my time. And for the first time, he let himself ask the question he'd been avoiding. What did I owe him? Respect? Appreciation? Partnership? Or was that just something he'd imagined we had? He thought about the early days of our relationship. Back when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. When we stayed up all night talking about everything and nothing. He missed that version of us. But the more he tried to picture it, the more it felt like a different lifetime. Like those people were strangers who had no connection to the life we were living now. That night, sitting alone in the dark, he realized something else. He wasn't angry because of what I'd said. He was angry because deep down, he knew I was right. I didn't owe him my time. But if that was true, then he didn't owe me his. The version of himself that had been bending over backward to keep us together, he didn't owe me that. The sacrifices, the compromises, the endless effort. And he sure as hell didn't owe me the benefit of the doubt anymore. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But in some strange way, it also felt like clarity. If I didn't see our marriage as a partnership, then maybe he needed to stop pretending it was one. Maybe it was time to stop giving more than he got. To stop measuring his worth by my approval. Maybe it was time to start looking out for himself. After that night, something inside him clicked. It wasn't dramatic, like flipping a switch. It was quieter than that, more like a slow tide pulling back. He didn't wake up and decide to stop trying. He just stopped, piece by piece. He began to pull himself out of our marriage. It wasn't out of spite, though he'd be lying if he said he didn't feel a small, bitter satisfaction watching me notice the shift. No, it was more about survival. About protecting what little was left of him. The first thing he stopped doing was filling the silence. I had always been content to let him carry our conversations. Whether it was over breakfast, during a drive, or in the evenings when we'd sit in the same room but feel a million miles apart. He was the one who kept things moving. If he didn't ask about my day, I wouldn't volunteer anything. If he didn't start talking about something, anything, the room would just sit in awkward quiet. So he stopped. He stopped asking, stopped prodding, stopped smoothing over the cracks with words. And to his surprise, the silence didn't bother me nearly as much as it used to bother him. At first, I think I liked it. He'd catch me scrolling through my phone, my face relaxed, like the absence of conversation was a relief. But as the days passed and the silence stretched, something shifted. I started throwing out little comments. "You've been quiet lately, or is everything okay?" But he'd shrug them off. He wasn't giving me an opening to turn it back on him. To make this about how he was overreacting or being dramatic. He wasn't playing that game anymore. The next thing he stopped doing was the little acts of service he used to think mattered. For years, he'd been the one who noticed when my coffee supply was low. Or when my car needed gas. He was the one who picked up my favorite snacks at the store without being asked. Or stayed up late helping me sort through a work problem I couldn't figure out. Those things used to make him feel good. Like he was contributing to our life together. But now they felt like currency he'd been spending on someone who didn't even realize he was paying. So he let them go. If my gas tank was empty, I'd have to fill it. If I needed something from the store, I could go myself. It wasn't long before I noticed. "Why didn't you put gas in my car?" I asked one morning, my tone sharp with annoyance. He just looked at me and said, "It wasn't empty when I last drove it." That was it. No explanation. No apology. The look on my face told him I wasn't used to this version of him. The one who didn't jump to fix things before they became a problem. The strangest part was how easy it was to let go of these habits. He thought it would feel unnatural. Like he was betraying some fundamental part of who he was. But it didn't. If anything, it felt freeing. For the first time in years, he wasn't bending himself into knots trying to anticipate my needs. He wasn't chasing my approval or fighting for my attention. He was just existing. And as lonely as that existence sometimes felt, it was still better than feeling like a ghost in his own life. My response to his withdrawal was subtle at first. I started poking at him more. Little criticisms about how he folded the laundry, or how he left the mail on the counter instead of sorting through it. I accused him of being distracted during conversations we weren't actually having, of pulling away like it was some grand betrayal. And maybe it was, in a way. But if it was, it wasn't one he regretted. I think the moment I realized something was really different was the night he didn't react to one of my jabs. I'd made a snide comment about how he never listened anymore, my voice dripping with frustration. Normally, he would have apologized, or tried to explain himself, desperate to smooth things over. But that night, he just looked at me, shrugged, and went back to scrolling through his phone. My face fell, eyes narrowing in confusion. For once, he didn't rise to my bait. And the look on my face told him it unnerved me more than any argument ever could. That was the thing about me, I thrived on the balance of power. As long as he was the one chasing, the one fixing, the one apologizing, I was in control. But now he didn't know what to do. My silence, my indifference threw me off in a way he hadn't expected. And the more I tried to poke and prod him back into his old role, the more he pulled away. He wasn't doing it to punish me. Though he'd be lying if he said my frustration didn't give him a certain grim satisfaction. No, he was doing it because he needed to. He needed to see what would happen if he stopped trying so hard. He needed to see if I'd notice. Or if I'd even care. And you know what? For a while, it felt like I didn't. But that was okay. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't putting my needs ahead of his. For the first time, he was choosing himself. It wasn't immediate at first. I didn't seem to notice the change. Or maybe I noticed but thought it was temporary. Like a storm that would pass if I just waited it out. I wasn't sure which, but my reaction, or lack of one, was telling. For the first time in years, Jack stopped trying to be the glue that held us together. And I didn't seem to care. Not at first, anyway. But then something happened. The silence he left between us, the space he created by withdrawing, started to weigh on me. It was subtle at first. Little comments, half-hearted attempts to restart conversations. "You've been so quiet lately," I'd say. "Or is everything okay?" in a tone that was more curious than concerned. He'd shrug or give me a neutral response, and I'd let it drop. I wasn't used to him letting things sit unresolved. And I think it threw me off balance. For years, he had been the one who worked to bridge the gaps between us. If there was tension, he'd smooth it over. If there was silence, he'd fill it. If I pulled away, he'd chase me, trying to bring us back together. But now he wasn't doing any of that. He wasn't chasing, wasn't smoothing, wasn't bridging. He was just there. And his absence, his emotional absence, started to matter more than I expected. I started poking at him in ways I had before. Little criticisms about how he folded the laundry. Or how he left his shoes by the door. I complained that he didn't refill the gas tank. Or that he wasn't paying attention during conversations we weren't even having. I could tell I was trying to provoke him. To get a reaction. But he didn't bite. He let my words roll off him, refusing to give me the satisfaction of pulling him back. into the dynamic where I held all the cards. And that's when I realized something important. For years, I had been given control without even knowing it. Every time he apologized when he didn't need to. Every time he chased my affection. Every time he worked to fix things I didn't even notice were broken. I was handing him the upper hand. But now, by simply stepping back, by refusing to engage on my terms, he had taken that control away. And I didn't know what to do with it. The shift was palpable. It wasn't just in the way he spoke to me. It was in the way he looked at me. There was confusion in my eyes now. Maybe even a little fear. I'd glance at him across the room, my brow furrowed. Like I was trying to solve a puzzle I couldn't quite figure out. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had the upper hand. Not because he was trying to win some argument or prove a point, but because he had stopped apologizing for wanting more than I was willing to give. My confusion turned into something else over time. Effort. At first, it was subtle. I'd bring him a cup of coffee while he was working late. Or suggest we watch a movie together like we used to. But he didn't jump at the scraps of attention I offered. He let them hang in the air, unacknowledged. Not because he wanted to punish me, but because he needed to know if it was real. Was I trying because I cared? Or was this just another way to smooth things over, without addressing the root of the problem? The more he pulled back, the more I tried. It was like watching someone learn to swim by being thrown into the deep end. I was flailing, grasping at anything that might pull me out of the mess we were in. But he wasn't going to be my lifeline. Not anymore. If I wanted to fix this, I'd have to do it on my own. One night, I finally confronted him. "Are you mad at me?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. Like I was afraid of the answer. He looked at me for a long moment, weighing his words. "I'm just done trying harder than you," he said. It wasn't said with anger or malice. It was just the truth. My reaction was like watching a house of cards collapse. My mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. For once, I didn't have a comeback or a defense. I just stared at him, my eyes wide. Like I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And for the first time, I saw something crack in me. Fear. Not fear of losing control, but fear of losing him. That was the moment I knew the dynamic between us had shifted for good. I had spent years taking his effort for granted, assuming he would always be there. Always trying. Always giving. But now I was realizing that wasn't true. He wasn't going to keep pouring himself into a relationship that felt so one-sided. He wasn't going to keep fighting for something I didn't seem to care about. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. I could stay and let things continue as they were. Or I could draw a line and see what happened. I didn't know what the future held. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to keep chasing him. If I wanted to make this work, it was my turn to put in the effort. And if I didn't, well, he was finally ready to walk away. It was bound to happen sooner or later. The tension between us had been growing. Like a storm cloud, dark and heavy, waiting to break. I didn't plan for it to happen that night. But then again, when do confrontations ever go as planned? He came home from work to find me pacing in the living room. My arms crossed and my face set in that tight, determined expression he'd come to know all too well. The moment he walked through the door, I could feel the weight of my frustration. It was written in the way I didn't even wait for him to take off his shoes. Before launching into it. "What's going on with you, Jack?" I demanded, my voice sharp and clipped. You've been acting like a stranger in your own house. He paused, key still in his hand, and looked at me. For a second, I thought he might brush me off. Tell me he was just tired or distracted. But he couldn't do it. Not this time. What do you want, Emma? He asked. His tone even but cold. He wasn't angry, at least not anymore. He was tired. Tired of the same cycle. The same arguments. The same lack of resolution. I threw my hands in the air, exasperated. What do I want? Are you kidding me? I want to know what's going on with you. You've been quiet, distant, and... He cut me off before I could finish. I'm just following your lead, he said. That stopped me for a moment. I looked genuinely confused. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done trying harder than you, he said. His voice calm but firm. My face flushed red. And I could feel the flicker of anger in my eyes. Oh, so now this is my fault? I snapped. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay steady. It's not about fault, Emma, he said. It's about balance. Or more accurately, the lack of it. You made it clear what this marriage is and what it isn't. The night you told me you didn't owe me your time. For a moment, I thought I might deny it. But I didn't. Instead, I crossed my arms tighter and said, and I don't. I'm allowed to set boundaries, Jack. If you can't handle that, maybe that's your problem, not mine. The words stung, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he nodded slowly. You're right, he said. You don't owe me your time. But let me ask you this, what do you think I owe you? Do I owe you commitment? Do I owe you loyalty? Do I owe you anything beyond basic civility? My eyes widened. And for the first time in a long time, I saw something crack in my expression. Fear. Real, genuine fear. He didn't stop. Because if we're playing by those rules, Emma, then maybe I don't owe you date nights, emotional support, or even coming home at the end of the day. Maybe I don't owe you the sacrifices I've been making for years to keep us afloat when you've already made it clear that we're not a priority to you. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I just stared at him. My face a mixture of shock and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. That's not fair, I finally said. My voice shaking. You're twisting this into something it's not. I never said I didn't care about you. Then show it, he shot back. Because right now all I see is someone who wants the benefits of a marriage without putting in the work. You want me to be here to support you, to listen to you, to care about your needs. But what about mine, Emma? When was the last time you even asked how I'm doing? When was the last time you made me feel like I mattered? The room went silent. I looked like I wanted to argue, to defend myself. But the words wouldn't come. For a moment, I thought I might cry. But instead, I sank onto the couch and buried my face in my hands. I don't know how we got here, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Neither did I. And that was the hardest part. This wasn't the life he had imagined when we said our vows. This wasn't the person he thought he was building a future with. But now, standing there, looking at my crumpled figure on the couch, he realized something else. He didn't feel the need to fix it anymore. Instead of sitting down next to me like he would have in the past, he turned and walked away. Not out of cruelty or anger, but because he couldn't be the one to clean up the mess this time. If I wanted to fix this, I'd have to take the first step. The morning after our confrontation, the air in the house felt heavier than ever. It wasn't the kind of tension you could ignore or sweep under the rug. It was a quiet, suffocating weight that followed me everywhere I went. Jack moved through his usual routine, making coffee, checking emails, and leaving for work. But something about it felt hollow, mechanical. I was quieter than usual. And though I knew he was waiting for me to crack, to say something to ease the silence, I didn't. The text messages started around lunchtime. "We need to talk," I wrote. He ignored it. "Seriously, Jack, we can't just act like this isn't happening." I left that one unread too. I knew what he wanted. To drag me into another circular conversation, where nothing got resolved. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not anymore. When he came home that evening, I was pacing the living room, my phone in one hand and a glass of wine in the other. He could see it on my face. The frustration, the confusion, the fear. I'd been rehearsing something, that much was clear. But he didn't let me start. "What do you want, Emma?" he asked, dropping his keys on the counter. My head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "What do I want?" "Are you serious? You're the one acting like a stranger in our own house." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the sheer absurdity of it all. "A stranger? That's rich coming from you. I've felt like a guest in this marriage for years." "You didn't seem to mind then." My face turned red, and for a moment I thought I was going to shout. But I didn't. Instead, I bit my lip and sat down on the edge of the couch. My arms crossed tightly over my chest. "I don't know what you want me to say," I muttered. He didn't either. But he knew what he needed to say. "I can't do this anymore," he told me, his voice quieter than I expected. My head shot up, eyes wide. "What do you mean this? What are you saying?" "I mean, I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not. I can't keep giving and giving while you act like it's enough just to be here. I've spent years pouring myself into this marriage, Emma. And I'm exhausted." I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not angry anymore," he said, surprising even himself. "I'm not even hurt. I'm just done. I don't know if that means we separate. If it means counseling. Or if it means something else entirely. But I know I can't keep living like this." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, I just stared at him, my lips trembling like I was trying to find something to say. But nothing came. "So what, you're leaving?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "Maybe. Maybe not. But I think we need time apart to figure that out." My eyes filled with tears. And for a split second, he almost caved. Almost walked over to me, wrapped me in his arms, and told me we'd figure it out like we always did. But then he remembered my words. How I told him I didn't owe him my time. And the fire that had been keeping him going reignited. "This isn't just about you," he said, his voice firmer now. "You made it clear what you don't owe me. Now I'm making it clear what I won't keep giving without something in return." He grabbed the bag he had already packed. and headed toward the door. I didn't try to stop him. I just sat there, tears streaming down my face. As he stepped outside and shut the door behind him. That night, he stayed at a cheap hotel, staring at the ceiling for hours and replaying the events of the past few weeks. Had he made the right decision? Was this the end of our marriage? Or just the reset we needed to fix what had broken? By morning, he still didn't have answers. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to go back. The first few days apart were strange. He had dinner alone, sat in silence without the TV buzzing in the background, and went to bed without hearing my footsteps down the hall. At first, it felt liberating, a relief even. But as the days turned into nights, the loneliness began to creep in. Not because he missed me, but because he missed the idea of what we used to be. I called him on the third night. He almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of him. "Hey," I said, my voice small and hesitant. "Hey," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. He could hear my breathing, shaky and uneven. And he knew I'd been crying. "I don't know what to do," I finally said. My words hit him harder than he expected. This was the same woman who had always seemed so sure of herself, so unwilling to admit fault. Hearing me say I didn't have the answers threw him off balance. "I don't either," he admitted. It wasn't much, but it was the truth. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page, even if that page was blank. The phone call that night was the first crack in my armor. Hearing me admit I didn't know what to do was something he never expected. For years, I had been the one with the answers, or at least acted like I had them. That vulnerability caught him off guard. And for a fleeting moment, he felt a flicker of the connection we used to have. But as much as he wanted to lean into it, he couldn't ignore the weight of everything that had led us here. After that call, I began reaching out more frequently. I'd text him every day, sometimes with long rambling messages about how I was reflecting on what he'd said. Other times with simple notes like "I miss you." He didn't know how to respond most of the time, so he kept his replies short and neutral. He wasn't ready to engage fully. Not yet. A week after he left, I asked if he would consider coming home, so we could figure things out together. He told me no. If he was going to step back into that house, he needed more than words. He needed action. He needed proof that I was willing to meet him halfway. That I wasn't just saying what I thought he wanted to hear. To bring him back under the same roof. To my surprise, I didn't argue. Instead, I started taking steps on my own. I signed up for individual counseling, something I had always dismissed as unnecessary. I sent him photos of the journal I was keeping, filled with pages of reflections on the way I treated him, the things I had said, and how I wanted to change. It wasn't just words anymore. I was trying. Really trying. And as much as he wanted to be cautious, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. But here's the thing about hope. It's fragile. It's easy to let it blind you, to make you forget the reality of what brought you to this point in the first place. And no matter how much progress I seemed to be making, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had taken him walking out for me to start trying. That thought haunted him. Was my effort genuine? Or was it just a reaction to the fear of losing him? Would I still be this reflective, this vulnerable, if he hadn't drawn a line in the sand? Or would things go back to the way they were? Once I felt secure again? He kept his distance. Even as I reached out more and more. I called him late at night, my voice soft and hesitant, as I apologized for the things I'd said, for the way I'd made him feel. I didn't make excuses this time. Didn't try to turn the blame back on him, like I had so many times before. I was selfish, I admitted during one of those calls. I thought as long as I was present, that was enough. But it wasn't. I see that now. He wanted to believe me. God, he wanted to believe me. But belief isn't something you can force. It has to grow back on its own. Slowly and carefully. In the meantime, he set boundaries. He told me he wasn't ready to come home. Not yet. He needed time to think, to process, to figure out what he really wanted. If we were going to try again, it had to be different. He wasn't going to keep chasing my affection, or begging for scraps of attention. I needed to show him that I was willing to put in the work. Not just now, but consistently. For a while, it seemed like I was. I kept going to counseling, even when he wasn't ready to join me. I sent him updates, not to pressure him, but to show him I was serious about changing. I stopped blaming him for how distant he'd become, instead focusing on my own role in what had gone wrong. And yet, as much as he appreciated my effort, something still felt off. Maybe it was the timing. The fact that it had taken so much for me to get here. Or maybe it was the realization that he didn't trust me. Not to slip back into old habits once the dust settled. Trust. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? It wasn't just about my actions now. It was about whether he believed those actions would last. Whether he could trust me to value him. To respect him. To meet him halfway. Without him having to fight for it every step of the way. The nights alone in the hotel gave him plenty of time to think. He thought about the years he had poured into our marriage. The sacrifices he had made. The countless times he had put my needs above his own. He thought about the early days, when love had felt effortless. Before resentment and exhaustion had seeped into every corner of our lives. And he thought about himself. About the person he had become in this marriage. Tired, bitter, and invisible. And the person he wanted to be moving forward. Could we find our way back to each other? Maybe. But as the days turned into weeks, he started to realize that the answer didn't just depend on my effort. It depended on him. On whether he was willing to let go of the resentment. To rebuild the trust. To open himself up to the possibility of being hurt again. That was the hardest part. Letting go of the anger. The bitterness. The sense of injustice that had been his armor for so long. Because as much as he wanted to hold on to it, he knew he couldn't move forward. Whether with me or without me. Until he found a way to let it go. And so, for the first time in weeks, he sat down with a pen and paper. And started writing. Not to me, but to himself. A letter about what he wanted. What he needed. And what he refused to compromise on. A letter about the kind of love he deserved. Whether it came from me or from someone else. By the time he finished, he felt lighter. Not because he had all the answers, but because he finally understood the questions. the ones he'd been avoiding for years. In the end, it didn't happen the way I thought it would. There was no explosive argument. No dramatic confrontation. No grand moment of clarity where everything fell into place. The decision to walk away from our marriage came quietly. Like a candle burning out in an empty room. We kept talking over the weeks that followed. I was trying, he'd give me that. I kept going to counseling. Kept sending him long reflective messages. About how I wanted to do better. But no matter how much effort I seemed to put in, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Why now? Why did it take him walking out the door for me to start trying? Why did it take this level of distance? This level of pain? For me to finally see what he had been saying for years? And even if my efforts were genuine, how could he trust they would last? Once the fear of losing him faded? Those questions haunted him. He wanted to believe we could fix this. He wanted to believe there was a version of us that could still work. That could still find the love and connection we once had. But every time he pictured going back, he felt the same weight in his chest. The weight of knowing he'd be stepping into the same cycle. Just with a new coat of paint. He thought about the version of himself he'd become in this marriage. A man who was always giving. Always compromising. Always chasing after someone who seemed content to stay just out of reach. A man who had lost sight of his own needs. His own worth. In the name of keeping the peace. And then he thought about the version of himself he wanted to be. Someone who didn't have to fight for affection. Or beg for scraps of attention. Someone who was valued, respected, and loved. For who he was. Not just for what he could give. One evening, after another long day of silence and reflection, he made his decision. He wasn't going back. Not because he hated me. Not because he wanted to punish me. But because he had finally realized that staying would mean losing himself all over again. He called me that night. It wasn't an easy conversation. But it was a necessary one. Emma, he began, his voice steady but firm. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us, about the last few years. About what I want for my future. And as much as I appreciate the effort you've been putting in, I don't think I can come back. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When I finally spoke, my voice was soft, almost pleading. So that's it? You're just giving up? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about giving up. It's about being honest. With you, with myself. I've spent years trying to make this work, Emma. Years of sacrificing, compromising, and bending over backward to keep us afloat. But I can't keep pouring into something that's left me so empty. I started to cry then. And for a moment, he felt the familiar urge to comfort me. To tell me everything would be okay. But he stopped himself. This wasn't his mess to clean up anymore. I'm filing for separation, he said gently but firmly. It's not because I don't care about you. I do. But I can't keep holding on to a relationship that no longer serves either of us. We've grown too far apart. And I think it's time we both accept that. I didn't argue. I didn't try to change his mind. I just cried softly on the other end of the line. And when the call ended, he sat there in silence, letting the weight of his decision settle over him. The next few weeks were a blur. of paperwork, awkward phone calls, and quiet goodbyes. I didn't contest the separation. And while it hurt to close that chapter of his life, he knew it was the right choice. Walking away wasn't easy. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was choosing himself. He wasn't staying out of obligation, or fear, or the desperate hope that things might get better. He was leaving because he deserved better. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with letting go. At first, it felt like stepping into a void. Like he was free falling with no idea where he would land. But as the days turned into weeks, that void began to feel less like emptiness and more like possibility. He started to rebuild his life, one small step at a time. He reconnected with friends he hadn't seen in years, spent time rediscovering hobbies he'd given up, and started focusing on his own happiness for a change. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when he missed the idea of what we used to be. But those moments were fleeting. And each time they passed, he felt a little stronger, a little more certain that he had made the right choice. Looking back, he doesn't regret the years he spent with me. Our marriage wasn't all bad. And there were moments of love and connection he'll always cherish. But he's learned that love isn't enough. Not if it's one-sided. Not if it comes at the expense of your own sense of self. He doesn't know what the future holds. Maybe one day he'll meet someone who values him in the way he's learned to value himself. Or maybe he won't. And that's okay too. Because for the first time in a long time, he's not measuring his worth by someone else's approval. As he sits here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, he feels a strange sense of peace. He's not angry anymore. Not bitter or resentful. He's just free. Free to be himself. To set boundaries. To demand the kind of love and respect he deserves. And that, I think, is the greatest gift he could have given himself. End.